Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast, and Hunter is joining me on the podcast today. Welcome, Hunter.
Welcome to you, Autumn.
We are without our technical director, Jesse Cowan, today. So if our podcast is a little bit squirrely, you know why.
We are not being babysat. We have been left alone in the green room with a recording device. I don't know what you would call it. It's a computer, a recording computer running. And our producer, Jesse, is away. So when the cat's away, the mice will play.
Yep. So we're gonna see how this goes. This has only happened one other time in the Vision for Life podcast history, when Jesse trusted us to record an episode without him.
and that one was fantastic.
Yeah. We made it. It got released and everything. So I have high hopes for us today, Hunter. We are going to discuss our top reads from 2021. And we came up together with a list of 10 books.
I think we might have 11.
Oh, we might have 11 books.
You snuck one in at the end.
Whew. All right. We came up with 11 books, just to throw you off, that we would recommend, that we read during this past year. And one of our regular types of episodes here on the Vision for Life podcast is VFL Reads, in which we discuss an article or a book that we have recently read and suggested to the other. Would be a good resource also for people who are in our church family or listeners on the podcast. And so this fits within that sort of category, VFL Reads. But Hunter, why is it important to take time to look back and discuss books that we've read during the past year?
Well, just consider the name of the podcast, Vision for Life. The whole idea is that when you live inside the story of the gospel and what God has done in Christ, that it gives new meaning and purpose to your life, and you live a far bigger story than kind of the story that our modern world gives us. But that doesn't happen without reflection, and that doesn't happen without prayer. And so reading is a way to reflect on the world we live in, on life. Sometimes it's a way to reflect specifically on Scripture or on the gospel. Some of our books will help our listeners do that. Some of them are just reflections about the world that we live in. But that's the main reason that I read. Now, secondarily, and probably not too secondarily, I read for fun. It's just enjoyable. But I don't primarily read what my mom calls rubbish. My mom reads rubbish. My mom was a literature professor for a long time, specialized in reading great works of literature. And then somewhere in late Middle Ages, my mom just started reading crap. And so she just reads purely for entertainment now by trading rubbish novels with her friends. And Mom, if you're listening,
so maybe the secondary,
this is not a surprise.
Maybe the secondary purpose of this is to say, don't read the sort of books that your mom reads right now.
Don't read rubbish. Well, I was actually making a slightly more sophisticated point than that. I think my mom reads just for entertainment. It's kind of to her like watching a TV series is for me. It's more entertainment than it is reflection, and that's not a bad reason to read. But I primarily read for reflection, and then secondarily for enjoyment, entertainment. So that'll, I think, show up in the kinds of books we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think our book list is heavily weighted that way.
Yes.
In the insight and reflection and understanding of the world that we live in. They're geared that
Beach
direction.
reads are great, but I go to the beach at best once a year. So what do I do when I'm sitting in a cold Denver winter by the fireplace? I'm going to reflect.
Well, I think we're starting off our list, though, with the fiction category.
We are, and reading for reflection does not mean don't read fiction. In fact, you need to read fiction, and this was a discovery for me several years into pastoral ministry. I had come through a season where I'd gone to grad school, seminary. I'd read a lot of theology, a lot of nonfiction. I primarily read nonfiction Christian books, heavy academic kind of Christian books, even after seminary, for years and years and years. And I reached a point in in life where I realized like I'm kind of becoming dull and dry, and it was really the discovery of reading fiction and literature, which can sometimes include memoir, it can sometimes include essays, but it was really discovering this whole fiction and literature reading that most people have known about forever, that I think added some enjoyment back into my reading and took me into a different kind of reflective space. So that's our first categories, fiction and literature. I discovered a theme this year in my fiction and literature reading, and this wasn't intentional, but it did kind of tend to be true of the books that I gravitated toward. They are fiction that is written about societies in transition. And I think that's interesting because I do feel like the era we're living through right now, which might just be the last, 10, 15 years, is a real transitional time in American life and in modern societies. And so I'm kind of attracted to books that are about societies in transition, written from a fictional standpoint. And the first one I'll recommend is by Marcel Proust, who is the great early 20th century French novelist. And this year I've read 2 volumes by Proust, but the one I'm going to recommend is Sodom and Gomorrah, which is the 4th volume in his series of novels. In fact, he really only wrote one series of novels. That was his main contribution to the world. And the series of novels is called In Search of Lost Time, and it's 7 volumes. I'm not through with it yet. But this year I read Sodom and Gomorrah, which is number 4, and then I read The Prisoner, which is number 5. But I'm going to recommend Sodom and Gomorrah. It's set in this transitional time in early 20th century French society, and what's happening back then is the aristocracy, think the counts and the duchesses and the dukes and the French nobility, the aristocracy is in decline. They really don't have as much official roles and capacities as they used to. And then there is this huge emerging kind of new money class in French society, sometimes called the bourgeois. And these two groups are kind of mixing in French society, and it's kind of this Gilded Age. Proust was among the bourgeois. He lived among that society, and he kind of moved in French high society, and so he kind of writes from personal experience. And it's comedy. He's skewering the decadence of that society. And one of the major themes in this book is that people are not what they are projecting themselves to be, which I think is fascinating because I think that's a big theme in our society as well. People are not what they are projecting themselves to be. And then this volume, obviously, the biblical city of Sodom and Gomorrah was known for its sexual decadence. And this book is exploring the theme of romantic or sexual love and jealousy and how that can really corrupt people and societies. And what I think is fascinating about this book is it really is set at the time when the definition of love, quote, love, is really becoming more romantic and sexualized than it had ever been in history. And so it's like a depiction of what happens when society defines love in strictly romantic or sexual terms without the structures of commitment and marriage and those kinds of things. So I find Proust fascinating for that reason.
Could someone pick up Sodom and Gomorrah, this book that you're talking about, and just read that one out of the 7 books? Or...
Theoretically, they could. I would actually say, if you're going to read Proust, go back to the beginning because the characters build. And so this book has characters who he's developed previously, and it would probably help you to know who these characters are and kind of what their character arc has been. So if you go back to the beginning, the very beginning, the first novel is called Swann's Way, and it's great. And I would start there.
So the next book on our list is called Crossroads. This is also a book that you recommended, Hunter. And both of these first 2, Sodom and Gomorrah and Crossroads, I have not read. So I'm going to pitch to you to let our listeners know about this recommendation as well.
Okay, so if Sodom and Gomorrah was written in the 1920s, or published in the 1920s. Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen was published this year. It came out in October of this year. And I think Jonathan Franzen is one of the best living American writers out there. So when Jonathan Franzen is going to release a novel, I pre-order it on Amazon and just let it show up when it shows up. So it showed up in October of this year. And Crossroads is set in the 1970s in suburban Chicago, and it centers around a liberal church youth group. In fact, the main character, one of the main characters in the novel, is an associate pastor of kind of this progressive church in suburban Chicago, and then the main characters are his family members. So it's about the kind of the dysfunctional life of his family, and then they're all connected in some way to this youth group that has the name Crossroads. So that's where the novel gets its name. And Jonathan Franzen says that this is going to be the first novel in a trilogy of novels he's going to write that explore how American mythologies have developed since the 1970s. And by mythology, he means the stories we tell ourselves to make sense out of the world. In one interview about this novel, and this novel got a lot of attention, so if you pick up any major publication that has an emphasis or focus on literature, whether it be the New York Times, the Washington Post, all major newspapers reviewed this novel. Magazines like the Atlantic, the Paris Review, the New Yorker, they're all going to publish their reviews of Franzen's work. But in one of the interviews, he said, "I've been thinking a lot about the inescapable nature of religion, even if it's uncoupled from transcendent beliefs or metaphysical structures. Everyone still organizes their life around something that can't be proved. I would say this goes particularly for the virulent atheist." So he's saying we all organize our lives around something that can't be proved, and he's writing a series of books to reflect back to us what are the stories that we're organizing our lives around. He went on in that interview to say he was trying to write a book about religion that is only experiential without theology. Now, I think Franzen sees that as a good thing. I think he would generally be pro-religion that is experiential without theology. I don't think he likes Christian theology necessarily. But I find it a fascinating reflection on what happens when you uncouple a religion from its doctrinal, what happens when you uncouple Christianity from its doctrinal or its theological or its biblical teachings. And what he reflects back to us is it's primarily driven by therapeutic categories, and the people are falling apart in the novel. So that's fascinating. I should probably give a warning to our listeners that the novel does have some sexual scenes that are, depending on your tolerance for those things, you want to skip them, or you just want to be aware of that going into it. Okay, so now it's my turn to pitch it back to you, because you read several things that would classify as fiction and literature that I think are fascinating that I haven't read. In fact, one of these books that you're going to talk about, I'm like, I'm getting that book, and I'm going to give it to my mom too. So, Mom, I'm going to give you a non-rubbish book. So, give us that one.
Yes. So it's nonfiction, but it fits into this category of fiction and literature. And it's called Pastoral Song, A Farmer's Journey. And the word pastoral is used in the title in the sense of related to the keeping or grazing of sheep or cattle, not sort of pastoral in a ministerial sense, but pastoral as it's connected to land and animals. It's called Pastoral Song, A Farmer's Journey by James Rebanks. The first part of the book is him recounting scenes from his childhood. He was raised in England's Lake District in the Langdale Valley, and his grandfather was the one who he speaks of most in this first section of the book. His grandfather was cut from a particular sort of cloth and had farmed using these old methods and embodied these values that really pushed against consumerism and thought it very important that you have a high respect for your land and your animals. And so he talks about being shaped in that sort of family and with that mentality. And then he watched his dad inherit the farm and begin to experience this sort of crossroads between modernization of farm life, farm equipment, farming methods, the use of pesticides, all of these current questions that still now impact our farming practices today, and what we know to be industrialized farming and ranching methods. And so he watched his dad and his grandpa quibble over some of that. He experienced them struggling with how to modernize, what implications that had as far as the use of their land, how it impacted their animals. But he is exploring more how it impacted their attitudes towards the land, their connection to it and to their animals. I would liken James Rebanks he has another book that I have read some of. This is the only full work of his that I've read. But he also, the author, not only was raised on this farm and then had farming experience in some other places. For a while, he worked in Australia on a couple of farms. He shares some of that story as well in this book. The last part of the book is talking about what we've lost through industrialization of farming and ranching, and not only what we've lost in the sense of those values that he speaks of in the first part of the book, but also what we've lost in an attitude towards land and animals that is very consumeristic and consumer driven. And so how connecting those older values and appreciation of the land back into his current farming methods and his view of farming helps him have a value for and respect of the land, the animals, and the people immediately around him. But the reason this book resonated so deeply with me was it is very beautifully written. I would liken James Rebanks to maybe the Wendell Berry of the UK. In fact, Wendell Berry recommends.
Wendell Berry recommend. And if our listeners are familiar with Wendell Berry, he's a phenomenal contemporary American author. And I would recommend a great place to start with Wendell Berry is his novel, Jayber Crow, which I actually reread this year, almost put on my list, but I've read it 4 or 5 times.
You did put it on your list, but it was too far down, so we couldn't include it.
That's right, and I tried to read it.
It slipped in here anyway. Look at that.
I got him in.
So, side note recommendation, Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. But so the reason, though, this book resonated so deeply with me was because of my own childhood experience. I was raised in an agricultural area. I began working on a farm. I say that loosely. There was a farmer in our church who asked my brothers and I if we could go help with chores once a day. And then that turned into twice a day. And then as my brothers got older, they actually worked for him on his farm, helping during harvest. And this farmer's name was Mr. Riemenschneider. And I just became his tag-along and learned all about farming and all about animals. So much of what James Rebanks shares in his book, in Pastoral Song, about his experiences as a young child and that were so formative in his life really resonated with me because I have a deep appreciation for the connectedness of the people in agricultural places to the land and to the weather. And what Rebanks does really well is that he doesn't overly romanticize the life of the farmer, but he does capture how it is imbued with wonder. So some of my own reflections as I was reading his book and thinking back to my childhood and what I can recall from being outside, actually out in creation every day, were like the way the clouds move over a prairie landscape and dot it with shadows, and the way green wheat sways in the breeze, helping a cow birth a calf and watching it suckle for the first time, the smell of sweat flecks on the neck of a horse after trotting behind a herd of cows for an hour, bringing them in for a branding, frost-covered branches twisting and reaching towards the sky. And he captures so many of those scenes in his book and talks about how he's reflecting on them at different stages of his life. So as a child, riding along with his grandfather, watching what's happening from the back of a truck or a tractor, that was me. I would tag along with Mr. Riemenschneider and sit in the truck, in the back of a truck or on the back of a tractor and watch and observe. And I learned so much about life in that way. And I learned also many of the values that that Rebanks is relating in this book. So it's a beautiful book. In the end, what it's about is about finding a balance by using land and animals responsibly and sustainably and heeding the consequences of our actions. And so he is saying, he's advocating for building a new English pastoral that is not a utopia, but that is one in which the land, animals, and people are treated decently.
One of the books I'll share later reflected on how, as many modern people live in urban areas that are completely disconnected from land, and so that shapes our imagination of how we think life works and how we think God's world works. And we sometimes need to be reconnected to nature in order to really get a proper sense of even who we are in the world. So I am eager to read this book from that perspective. My great-grandfather was a farmer, cattle farmer, and I remember before he passed away as a kid, I got to know him, which was awesome, and would ride around in the pickup truck to look at the cows and look at the pigs, and those were formative experiences in ways that I wasn't even aware of at the time. Okay. Now, is there anything else that you just want to slip in here or name check? Like I just name checked Jayber Crow. Anything else? Anything you want to name check for us?
No.
Okay.
No, not at this moment.
I'll name check a book called Slouching Toward Bethlehem by Joan Didion, which was written to describe her experiences in California in the 1960s. And that, again, a society in complete flux. And she really reflected well on that. And I love her writing. So it's a book of essays. So you can read a few of the essays.
I'll share a children's literature recommendation in a moment that is a fictional narrative, but I didn't submit any just works of fiction into this section. However, I'm reneging on what I said a moment ago when you said, do you want to slip anything in here? And I said no. And now I'm thinking, oh yes, there is actually a novel that I read that I really enjoyed. It was recommended to me by Renee Moreland, who is a fantastic reader. If you ever need a recommendation for a book, particularly a great work of fiction, ask Renee. She always recommends really good books and is really thoughtful about it and is well read. But she recommended a book to me called The Lincoln Highway. It's written by Amor Towles. He also wrote A Gentleman in Moscow, which maybe people would be more familiar with. This is a recent work of his, The Lincoln Highway, but it's just a really fun read. All right, let's move on to our next category, and that is biography.
Yeah, my favorite biography I read this year was a biography of Martin Luther, and there's a lot of good biographies of Martin Luther out there. This one is the big 3-volume, originally written in German biography. It's been translated to English, and I just read volume 1 this year. And so the book is titled Martin Luther, and then the subtitle is His Road to Reformation from the years 1483 to 1521. It's by Martin Brecht, Brecht. So this book describes Luther's childhood up through kind of what we would know as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It really focuses on his spiritual crisis as a monk and how he's really wrestling with just his sense of guilt before God that came from just knowing God's law and feeling like he couldn't measure up. And then he also starts protesting against the practices of indulgence selling in the church at the time. And then so it kind of chronicles all of that and the fallout that starts to happen as a result of his protest against indulgences. And then sometime after his protest against indulgences, Luther had a breakthrough on his spiritual crisis. And his breakthrough was when he really rediscovered, or for him discovered for the first time, the doctrine of justification by faith in Christ. And he discovered it by reading and really studying Psalms, Romans, Galatians, Hebrews, and by reading the church father Augustine. And what I find fascinating was I kind of knew the general outline of that story. I did not appreciate until I read this how slow Luther's breakthrough was. Like he lived at a time when a lot of people were dissatisfied with the church, and they were dissatisfied with the spirituality that they were being taught by the church. So there was a lot of angst toward the church and toward the spirituality the church was teaching at the time. Luther wasn't alone in that, which I think is a fascinating parallel to our time as well. And then Luther's breakthrough was not like a sudden aha moment. It was years and years and years of struggling. But what finally got him through was he read the Bible, he studied the Bible, and then he read the Bible in conversation with teachers who were outside of his own era. So he goes back almost 1,200 years to Augustine, and to get outside of his own era, to get back to the text of the Bible and outside of his own era. And both of those were kind of unique in his time. Bible study was not well known or widely done. In fact, the Bible was only available in its original languages of Hebrew, Old Testament, and Greek, New Testament, and then it had been translated into Latin. So you had to be trained in Latin, which most ordinary people weren't, in order to read the Bible. But Luther had been trained in Latin, and so as a monk, he really studies the Bible, and he realizes that the spirituality he's learned is not the same thing he's being taught in the Bible. And then to kind of help him understand what he's reading in the Bible, he had to get outside of his own era and go way back to the church fathers. And that's where he had his breakthrough. And it wasn't sudden, it wasn't spontaneous, but what was encouraging to me was just this reminder: I need to be in the text, and I need to be reading perspectives that are outside of the modern perspective. And I would say that to anyone who is anxious about the spirituality that you've inherited, you're frustrated with the church, you're probably not going to get centered just by reading other people in the same stage of life as you are. Luther certainly didn't get settled that way. Probably what's going to help you the most is to actually study the Bible for yourself, and then to read some faithful interpreters of the Bible who are just outside of this contemporary era in which we're living.
I think that to what you said earlier about reading so much about transitional moments in history, I mean, Luther's work really ushered in a transitional moment within church history, to be sure. And that's fascinating to think about how those insights into his own writing, the way he was shaped and formed, and the conclusions he came to based on his study of the Bible and history spoke to that moment, and how impactful that can be for us to take that to heart as well.
And what really struck me about this breakthrough was when he broke through, it was a flood, a volcanic eruption of joy in him. And this joy sustained him through a really hard season of his life. What happened is he went on heresy trial, and it wasn't like a single trial. It was like a series of trials. It's even hard to kind of follow some of the ins and outs of his heresy trial, and he could be executed as a heretic. Like his life is literally on the line. But he had so much joy in his newfound status in Christ that he was kind of glad to endure all of that. And I do think that's what's missing from our modern dissatisfaction with, whether it be dissatisfied with evangelicalism or dissatisfied with the church we grew up in or whatever. There's no joy there. And Luther had a breakthrough of joy that was connected to Bible and rediscovery of the gospel. I'm eager to read Volume 2 next year, because Volume 2 will now kind of trace out the beginnings of the Reformation that resulted. This is really focused in on just his own personal journey so far, and it's been great for me to read at the end of this kind of tumultuous year in our world.
We'll see if Volume 2 makes it on to the recommended reads.
I'm sure it will. Year. It's already got a spot.
You're forecasting that it's going to be held there.
It's already got a spot along with the next volume of Proust.
That's right. All right. So our next recommended book in this genre of biography is called A Burning in My Bones, and it was written by Winn Collier. And this is the biography of Eugene Peterson. This is actually a book that both you and I read.
That's right.
This past year.
I think it's important to note the subtitle of this book is The Authorized Biography of Eugene Peterson. So Eugene Peterson actually invited the author, Winn Collier, to spend time with him, and he kind of commissioned this biography to be published after his death.
He made much of his own writing and his journaling available to Winn Collier in preparation for him to write this biography.
And for our listeners who are unfamiliar, Eugene Peterson was a pastor, and he was a Presbyterian pastor in America, and he sat in kind of the evangelical-ish stream of Presbyterianism. He was, for those who know theology, he was probably more Barthian in his theology, probably followed the theology of Karl Barth, who wouldn't be exactly like a evangelical in his view of Scripture, but orthodox in his understanding of the gospel. That was Eugene Peterson. Pastored a small church that he planted and had a significant writing ministry as
He
well.
authored over 30 books and had a short stint as a theology professor as well at Regent College in Vancouver.
And this really reflects on his own spiritual journey and particularly his wrestling with vocation and his vocation as a pastor. Like, how does he come to terms with his vocation as a pastor? And I find it fascinating because there's a lot of different descriptions out there of what it means to be a pastor that aren't necessarily biblical, but are just expectations that church or culture loads onto us. And I think Eugene Peterson did a great work in his life to go back and go, what does Scripture call pastors to be and to do? What does it actually mean to be a pastor? So I find him helpful for that. I'm curious what you found interesting about it.
The title itself, A Burning in My Bones, was something the author came up with. This is his explanation, Winn Collier's explanation of that title. This hunger for something radical, something so true that it burned in his bones, was a constant in Eugene's life. His longing for God ignited a ferocity in his soul. So even as Collier jumps into the different facets of Peterson's life as a father, as a husband, as a pastor, and through a lot of hard vocational decision points, like you just mentioned, he really represents that this longing for holiness and a longing for relationship, real relationship with God, was a constant force in Eugene's life. And he shares how that looked in these different aspects of his life as a father and as a husband, and how his longing for holiness, his dependence upon God, his desire for relationship with God affected each of those areas and really affected his perspective on pastoring as well, which you see take shape in his struggles within his church and what he shares as very difficult moments or even seasons within his pastoral ministry. But how his continual pursuit of holiness and of God really steadied him through those difficult seasons. It was incredibly refreshing to read this sort of biography and this sort of account of a man's life at a time when I think failures in ministerial leadership take up a lot of public airspace. And to read about this influential pastor, not because he pastored a very large congregation, but because he was continually faithful and pursued God and relationship with God and others through his whole life. And that was actually, in the end, what made him incredibly influential and made his voice have such sustaining power for a lot of different people.
And when we say someone who is committed to holiness, pursuing holiness, we often think of a very austere, boring person. And one thing I just was impressed by in reading this is how normal in a lot of ways Eugene Peterson was.
Yes.
He was very physical, meaning he liked to do physical activity. He was refreshed by being out in nature and by being competitive. And he just enjoyed good meals and times with friends and walks with his wife and reading. And so he was a very normal guy who enjoyed the good things in God's world while also pursuing holiness. So he wasn't, in that sense, like a monastic kind of guy. And I find that very relatable.
And the representation, too, when Collier makes of both Jan and Eugene Peterson, in what you're saying, was that they were incredibly down to earth and humble. And regardless of how much acclaim any of his books began to give him, he became a very well-known author and speaker. When Collier states that they maintained this sort of affect, that they were always inviting people in, always asking how they could be generous towards people who needed help, always humble. And when Collier, in sharing about writing this and spending time with the Petersons, says, whenever I'd come back up to the house, Eugene would ask, well, Winn, did you find anything worthwhile? I'd smile big. Boy, did I. He always asks questions like this with genuine bewilderment. I don't know why anyone would be interested in any of this. He's said to me multiple times, everything has just been a gift. And in summation, Collier said for his own self that what was so impactful was that he now believes that he wants to do what the Petersons did, and that is try to pay attention to the holiness and the wonder of this life they've been given in the everyday moments of life.
Okay, Autumn, anything you want to name check in this biography category?
Yes, in fact, I'm not even going to go back on that. Yes, I do have one other recommended biography. It's called Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, and it was written by Kate Clifford Larson. Fannie Lou Hamer was very influential in the civil rights movement. John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, eulogized her and talked about how important she had been to the movement. But her name was somewhat lost until a couple of recent biographers wrote about her upbringing and her struggle, namely in the area of voting rights, and then talked a lot about her work, but also the ongoing effect of her work. So that would be my other recommendation within this genre. All right, let's move on to our next category. We have one recommendation, Hunter, that you submitted, and this is historical.
Yeah, I try to read a little bit of history every year. Some years I read more than others, but this year I read a book about recent history, and I think it was really important to understand maybe the year we're getting ready to go through. This book is called Defenders of the Unborn, subtitle, The Pro-Life Movement Before Roe v. Wade. It's by Daniel K. Williams, who is an excellent historian, especially of kind of American religion. This is the history of the pro-life movement that began in the 1930s and how it emerged really before Roe versus Wade polarized this debate. And what Williams is pointing out is that the pro-life movement originated as a human rights campaign. It really focused on the right to life of the unborn. And I appreciate that he brought this discussion back to that. Do the unborn have a right to life? Now, the author is not advocating a particular point of view here as much. He's just documenting what this movement argued. And he's saying, hey, they grounded this. It was started primarily Catholic, but then it brought in Orthodox Jews and Protestants as well. And they grounded their argument in classical liberalism, which is kind of the commitment to human rights that our nation began with. And you could be a classical liberal and be a Republican or a Democrat. And he actually makes the point. That's why it was not partisan, because it was grounded in human rights, particularly the right of the unborn. And I found it to be fascinating because I do think that is the category through which we can see this as a nonpartisan issue. It's really about the question of whether unborn are people or persons who have human rights as a result. Now, he also starts to talk about how it becomes more polarized, and he points out that feminism became increasingly influential within the Democratic Party, and feminism started to argue that a woman had reproductive rights and she needed to have the right to not have a baby in order to have full rights. And so really it became this clash of rights, the unborn child's rights versus the mother's rights. And as feminism became more ascendant within the Democratic Party, the pro-life movement kind of lost the argument within that stream. So he documents all of that. I think it's really helpful, especially in light of the Supreme Court right now looking at cases that may have huge impacts on Roe v. Wade, and these arguments about whose rights have priority are going to be in our public discourse and debate. And this helped me kind of get it just out of the immediate context of political polarization, which we're living, and kind of go back to what the original argument was.
Recently, David Brooks wrote an opinion essay. He regularly writes for the New York Times, and he wrote an opinion essay on abortion and his own sort of coming to grips with an understanding at present of it and how uneasy this issue is in our country right now. But it represents well sort of the conflict within the modern democratic mind.
It does.
On this matter of abortion.
It does. And I read that too, disagreed mightily with David Brooks's reasoning, and thought his kind of where he landed was not sufficient to kind of a Christian understanding of God and the world. But I do think, to your point, David Brooks kind of represents the tension that people feel.
Yes, exactly.
And this book helped remind me of that as well.
That is our only book recommendation in that category of history. But I have one, unless you want to slip one in here for children's lit, Hunter.
Well, I do want to recommend one. The book Policeman Small is fantastic. And
Great. Okay.
I checked it out of the library regularly as a kid. I've given it to a couple of kids, and they now know me as the guy who gave me the Policeman Small book. So I'm just going to recommend that.
Great. Policeman Small, recommendation from Hunter. Why do you enjoy that book, Hunter?
I have no idea why. It's just about a policeman going through his daily duties, and and he's doing simple stuff like cleaning up spilled milk and running a traffic sign.
Yep.
It's back when policing was easy.
You think? A nostalgic recapturing of policing.
It probably says something about me that I was attracted to policemen as a kid. I'm like, I like
as a small child.
He gets to run things.
Well, I do have a recommendation in children's literature. It's a set of 4 books called the Wingfeather Saga, written by Andrew Peterson. And if you're a fan of the Chronicles of Narnia or The Lord of the Rings, then this is probably fits sort of in that world of literature. It's written about a fantastic journey that 3 siblings take, and it is excellent as a read aloud or as an audiobook. The first is called On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. This is a little snippet that explains something of the beginning of the book. Once in a cottage above the cliffs on the dark sea of darkness, there lived 3 children and their trusty dog, Nugget. Janner, Iggaby, his brother Tink, their crippled sister Lily, are gifted children, as all children are, loved well by a noble mother and an ex-pirate grandfather, but they will need all their gifts and all that love to survive the evil pursuit of the venomous fangs of Dang who have crossed the dark sea to rule the land with malice and pursue the Iggabys who hold the secret to the lost legend and jewels of good King Wingfeather of the shining isle of Aniera. But the kids themselves, the characters, are very richly written and developed, and they're full of heart and smarts and courage. I think they encourage our own children to be curious and creative and adventurous. And On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness, so that's the first of these 4 books, I would recommend the whole set, the Wingfeather Saga. But it presents a world of wonder and a tale that children of all ages, I said it's a great read aloud, so parents can appreciate the story and definitely enjoy it as well. Families and readers groups can discuss its internal layers of meaning about life's true treasure and how the beautiful and horrible and temporal and eternal and good and bad are all tangled up, not only in this world, in the Wingfeather Saga, but in our own world. And that's what makes it such a rich read.
Sounds fascinating. And your children's book recommendations are encouraging exploration, and mine are encouraging rule keeping. Because my favorite children's book starts, Policeman Small was a traffic cop. He tells the cars when to go and stop. That's just very, very clear.
Yeah, but in this one, you're right. There's definitely a juxtaposition here. The Igabys are trying to overthrow the evil that has taken over their world.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
We called our next genre, so the two recommendations that we're going to share next, we titled them under culture.
And a lot of the books are about the culture that we live in, but these particular books are actually written as examinations of modern culture. And the first one is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. The subtitle is Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to the Sexual Revolution. You want to tell us what it's about?
In The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Trueman is examining our modern understanding, particularly in Western culture, and really specific to America, our modern understanding of the self. And he sorts out the long-term structural causes of the sexual revolution from its short-term and immediate causes. And so he determines the preconditions for the sexual revolution that led to our modern notions of self. And his basic contention in the book is that the sexual revolution is a symptom rather than the cause of its efforts to redefine human identity. He says, centuries before the nation swooned when Bruce Jenner debuted as Caitlyn Jenner, for example, intellectual shifts were taking place that would make a cultural event like this moment possible. And so what Trueman offers is the story of those shifts. So he says he divides it into 4 parts and examines how our current moment and understanding of identity, and then what he relies on throughout it is this expressive individualism. I think you said that was even in the subtitle.
Yeah.
And how that came to be throughout the last few centuries.
What I really appreciate about this book are a couple of things. Number one, it might sound at face value as we're describing it like it's kind of some Christian screed against the sexual revolution. It's really not. It's examining how a society can begin to imagine reality, and people begin to imagine themselves in a society that would kind of lead to that. So it's very thoughtful in that sense. It's not a screed at all. And then the second thing he does really well is he summarizes and synthesizes a lot of history and then a lot of modern sociologists who have kind of studied how we got to where we are today, and people like Charles Taylor and Philip Reef, who honestly are hard to read. Like I've tried to read some of those guys and have read some of those guys, and it's hard work to read them. He really synthesizes them, describes what they're saying, and puts it in a way that we can understand. And so I just found myself able to understand how modern people think of themselves, like who am I, how they answer that question or try to answer that question, just understanding that better as a result.
He also, in the end of the book, takes that synthesis of those historical thinkers who have been influential in leading up to our modern understanding of the self and the realizations of expressive individualism and their implications in our current world. And he talks about the challenges that are posed to society and to the church and to the potential impact on religious freedom and to society at large, and ways in which we are going to begin to experience more and more of the inherent instability of the sexual revolution.
This is probably, of all the books we're talking about, this might be the hardest one to read, the most challenging read. I would highly recommend it to
take on the challenge.
Take on the challenge. I think you'll be better off for it. You'll learn a lot in the process and chip away slowly at it if you have to. I've studied a lot in this field of how modern people imagine themselves. So I actually found myself just plowing through this book because it was just bringing together so many threads of thought that I'd kind of been noodling on already. But if it's a slow read for you, let it be a slow read. It's really going to be worth your effort. But it's probably going to take some effort.
Mm-hmm. The next book in this category really builds on those same ideas. And this, we have both read. Hunter, I read at your encouragement, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. So I did it. I took on the challenge.
We might do a podcast series on it to help our listeners one day. Yeah.
Yes, it is excellent and incredibly helpful at gaining some insight and understanding into our modern world and the ideas that are inherent to our life in America right now. But this next book you have recently been very excited about.
This next book, I was sitting with a pastor friend. I actually just spent a weekend hanging out with him. Bob Thune, if you're listening, this book is because of you, on here because of you. And we were like sitting around watching football one night, and he was just reading this book during the football game. I'm like, what are you doing, man? He kept looking up from the book and just quoting me or quotes from the book, and I was like, hey, here's what's going on in the football game with the team that you like playing. And this book is
So
called...
he's giving you updates on the book, and you're just filling him in on what's going on in the football game.
That's exactly what was happening. So I was like, I've got to get this book. And so I got this book, and it's fantastic. It's called You Are Not Your Own, subtitle Belonging to God in an Inhuman World by Alan Noble. This book takes a lot of the same themes that Carl Trueman is showing us. And it's not so much a history like Carl Trueman's book is, but it does kind of tell us how the world we live in helps us, quote, be ourselves. And that's really Alan Noble's contention. He says, you are your own and you belong to yourself. That's like the fundamental modern narrative or story that we believe. Like, I belong to me, and I have to create me and express me, and then the world exists to give me tools to help me create myself, but I have to do it. And Noble just describes how our world does that. It helps us define ourselves. It helps us express ourselves. And then he says, hey, if we actually look at what's happening, that's leaving people burned out, depressed, anxious, and alone. And we're seeing that just in the mental health, the mental and psychological health of our world. And so he starts to show how the gospel offers a better solution, that you actually belong to God and are purchased by God. So this book both helps you understand our culture and then helps you see how the gospel really speaks prophetically and speaks in a good way, gives us things that our culture doesn't give us, and even gives us solutions to our longings that culture can't give us. And it's written at a very popular level. So I think this is easier reading than the Carl Trueman book we just discussed.
I'm excited to read it. I think that might be my next read, the first one of 2022, or maybe I'll get it in over Christmas break here. But I am looking forward to reading You Are Not Your Own, as I've heard you discuss it over the last couple of weeks. I definitely want to read that. I have one more book to slip into this category. I don't know if it fits best under culture. I know there are aspects of it that are really relevant to our culture, particularly to specific groups within our culture, but it also has a particular missiological bent. This is the book Urban Apologetics, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel. Multiple authors contributed to this book, but it was edited and put together by actually a friend of yours, Hunter, Dr. Eric Mason.
That's right. And several of my friends contributed to this book. Brandon Washington, who's a local pastor here in Denver, has a fantastic chapter in there. So I would highly recommend this, especially as the world we're living in is wrestling with issues of race and the history of race in America. I think this book will give you a vision for how the gospel can heal some of the damage that's been done through racism.
Our last category today is spiritual life. And I'm going to mention one book that we're not going to discuss much today, but then I'll let you, Hunter, finish out our episode with your final book recommendation. So the book I want to mention in this category is called Prayer in the Night for Those Who Work or Watch or Weep. It's by Tish Harrison Warren. And she bases this book around a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. There are some prayers in the category that are called in the Book of Common Prayer that are in this category of complines. And those are prayers that you pray at night as you're getting ready to go to bed. And you express your reliance on God as you sleep, believing that his sustaining power actually is relevant to your resting state and how he sustains all of life and us as we sleep. And the prayer itself says, "Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ, give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen." So Warren builds her book. It's a really beautiful book, and it speaks to the depth of human longing and suffering, and she builds it around that prayer.
Well, along those lines, I'll also name check a book by Megan Hill called Praying Together, and the subtitle is The Priority and Privilege of Prayer in Our Homes, Communities, and Churches. I actually met Megan last year. We did some book awards together. We judged some book awards together and got to work with her on that. She is a fantastic writer and thinker who is very practical, like practically helpful in her writing. So I thought her this little book on prayer in community was really helpful.
All right. And the final book recommendation.
Yeah, we wanted to end here. And we wanted to end here because I think this is the most important book I read. And it's the most important book I read because the subject of the book is the most important subject that I read about. And it's important in the sense that it grounds us. And in fact, this is the first book I read in 2021. So I had to think way back. It feels like forever ago that I read this. And even just thinking about back to it, I went and reread some journals where I just wrote some thoughts about this book, what I was gleaning from it. It made me say, I need to come back to that. I need to read this book, or I need to read something like this. I need to be thinking about this thing. This is the subject I need to come back to. This is the most important thing. Not because this is the best book ever, but this subject is the best subject ever. And the book is The Glory of Christ by John Owen. John Owen was a 17th century pastor in England. He was a Puritan, meaning he wasn't part of the official Church of England, but he was a 17th century pastor in England, and he wrote this book at the end of his life. It's the last thing he wrote. And he died in 1683. The book was published after his death. It's kind of an extended meditation on John 17:24, where Jesus says, "Father, I desire that they also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me because you loved me before the foundation of the world." And Owen says, I'm fixing to, I think that's my interpretation. He doesn't use the word fixing to, but I'm getting ready to go.
It was not a common 17th century idiom.
Yeah, he was not a Puritan pastor in Alabama. So he says, I'm getting ready to die and I'm going to see the Lord. And what a great privilege that's going to be to see the Lord. I'm going to see his glory. And he starts to meditate on what he thinks he's going to see just based on what he knows of Christ from the Word of God. And it is 200 pages of just meditating on all the specific reasons Jesus is good and beautiful. And it is a fantastic way to start my year, just to be reminded that the Savior I serve is not just like, he didn't just save me, but he's extravagantly glorious and beautiful in his character and who he is. And that's the grounding of my life is just this generous person, glorious person, Jesus Christ, who is with the Father now. And so yeah, it's that's why it felt so important to me, and I wanted to end our conversation about books with that.
Thank you for joining me today, Hunter. I'm glad we could reflect on what we've read this last year, that we can share our reflections from these various books with you, our listeners. And we will post a link to our complete list. I know at the top of this, we said we had 10 or 11 books. We listed a lot more titles.
Yeah, you slipped in so many name checks.
Hey, now, you had a couple of your own as well. But we will share the complete list, all 11 plus 6 or whatever it was, in the description in our podcast notes. And we would also love to know, what was your most recommended read of 2021? Send it to us. Send us your reflections on something you've read or your most recommended read from 2021. Share it with me at podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. And while you're doing that, if you have suggestions or questions or comments, share those as well. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.